Every luxury watch tells more than just the time. It speaks of power, status, identity, and symbolism. In this video, The Secret Watches of the US Presidents, we reveal how presidential watches act as hidden codes of horology, shaping the image of leaders across generations. The journey unfolds chronologically, from the earliest figures in our timeline to today's presidents, showing how each watch reflects ambition and authority. And along the way, you'll discover the surprising story of a president whose watch carried an inscription predicting his rise to power. Let's start. Part 1. From War Rooms to Camelot: How Watches Built the Presidential Image. Dwight D. Eisenhower. First came the cool discipline of the post-war years, when legitimacy had to look reliable and precision had to look earned. Meanwhile, a fluted bezel and a familiar Jubilee cadence moved from a Swiss workbench to the most photographed desk on Earth. On the summer cover of a major magazine in 1952, Eisenhower's wrist turned a chronometer into a headline. Power first spoke from the wrist. Rolex marked a production milestone by gifting a Datejust engraved with 5 stars and initials, transforming a fine instrument into a readable document. However, the engraving did more than honor rank because it welded personal history to mechanical reliability in the public mind. Precision looked like policy made visible when the world needed steadiness. Reliability became policy on the wrist. What many did not see coming was how provenance would amplify the myth each time the watch changed hands. As the piece moved from trusted aide to family, the paper trail hardened rumor into record and record into legend. Even so, the chain of custody mattered because it kept the symbolism intact for future eyes. Authenticity strengthened the message. By the way, you'll never truly know what's hidden behind a presidential watch until you subscribe. Unlock the secrets of Rolex, Patek Philippe, and Cartier before history slips through your fingers. Eisenhower's choice never shouted luxury because it measured authority with a calm, certified tick. As a consequence of this, the watch became a visual shorthand for competence and continuity during fragile reconstruction. The metal did not boast because the office could not afford vanity after war and rationing. Functional prestige defined the aesthetic. John F. Kennedy, minimalist diplomacy. Meanwhile, the camera shutter that closed on a general opened on a younger America that wanted lightness as well as legitimacy. On the other hand, the wrist still carried the script, only now the script favored minimal lines over military utility. The new message was modern without being loud and confident without being heavy. Camelot stepped into the frame. Kennedy's inauguration carried an ultra-thin dress watch that did more than hide under a cuff because its very thickness argued for refinement over brute presence. However, the most surprising thing was not the profile, but the inscription from a close friend who addressed him as president before the oath was sworn. The gift turned the watch into a private prophecy. The inscription foreshadowed the office. Meanwhile, the rectangular geometry of a tank coded diplomacy by replacing bulk with balance and bravado with proportion. As a consequence of this, quiet Roman numerals and a leather strap suggested a leader who preferred economy of line to abundance of metal. Elegance became a form of policy communication to allies and rivals alike. Discretion signaled control. On the other hand, the pairing of ultra-thin refinement and pared-back geometry built a two-voice narrative that blended optimism with discipline. One voice spoke youth, modernity, and forward motion across a new decade's airwaves. The other voice answered with statecraft, etiquette, and reassuring poise when cameras never blinked. 2 codes, 1 message. What many did not see coming is that the nickname president would later cling to another model. Yet the bond between Crown and White House had already been set in gold on an earlier cover. However, names arrive late while photographs endure first and shape memory. As a consequence of this, myths need timeline corrections to keep the symbolism sharp. The lineage started earlier. But the most surprising thing is how the next era will rework authority so you can spot it from across the room before a microphone goes live. However, will classic visibility or discreet complexity set the tone when the flash fires? What many did not see coming is that two very different definitions of power will share the same stage. The duel is visibility versus whisper. Part 2. Classic authority versus discreet elite. One president's wrist carried a Rolex you could spot across a crowded room, while another hid a Patek that quietly calculated leap years in secret. Which form of power spoke louder? Ronald Reagan, classic visibility. Reagan understood the theater of leadership because he had lived inside it, and the watch he wore spoke a language the lens could read in an instant. However, it did not shout. It simply appeared with the dependable grammar of a fluted bezel and a familiar bracelet rhythm that telegraphed order. Meanwhile, the result was authority you could see without explanation, a signal that preceded words and steadied the frame. The image did the briefing. Authority arrived before words. Photographs from his California years already show a classic Rolex anchoring the wrist that gripped reins and fountain pens with equal discipline. On the other hand, the continuity from ranch to rostrum mattered because it replaced costume with character and prop with practice. Even so, the same legible layout that guided a day in the saddle guided a day in the West Wing when decisions needed clarity. Legibility equals leadership on camera. The dial rehearsed discipline. Observers sometimes noted that he wore the watch on the inside of the wrist, a habit learned by people who spend time on sets, ladders, and steering wheels where glare can be a nuisance. However, the practical habit also became a metaphor for control, because the time was visible to him first and the audience second. As a consequence of this, even a public symbol retained a private logic about work before spectacle. Utility preceded applause on purpose. The habit signaled craft. The bracelet choice said as much as the case, because its cadence is social shorthand learned by millions of eyes over decades. Meanwhile, that cadence paired with a fluted bezel creates a silhouette that any camera can catch at a glance across a briefing room. On the other hand, nothing about it feels experimental because the point was continuity, not novelty, and steadiness, not surprise. Stability outperformed novelty in hard times. The silhouette carried trust. What many did not see coming is how restraint reads louder than excess when the office is larger than the man. Even so, a classic watch becomes an amplifier for measured tone, the tick a metronome for delivery, the steel and gold a palette chosen to balance warmth and resolve. As a consequence of this, a familiar Rolex served as punctuation, not exclamation, at the end of policy sentences. The wrist finished the sentence softly. Calm won the frame. George H.W. Bush, discreet elite. Across the aisle of time, George H.W. Bush selected a different channel, one that spoke to insiders with the quiet fluency of traditional complications. However, this language is only obvious if you have learned it, because a perpetual calendar hides its genius under an ordinary glance. Meanwhile, the message is not "look at me," but "understand me." A vocabulary of thin cases, classic lugs, and a dial that whispers the structure of the year. Complexity whispered under cloth. A Patek Philippe perpetual calendar calculates the wandering of the calendar so the hand falls on the correct date through common years and leap years alike. On the other hand, that engineering triumph is almost invisible unless you read the subdials, which is precisely the point when your career has threaded through diplomacy and intelligence. Even so, accuracy becomes a worldview rather than a boast, a form of respect for order coded into brass and steel. Order lived on the dial. Provenance matters in quiet luxury because documentation converts anecdote into history that experts can test. As a consequence of this, the auctions that followed his presidency did more than set prices, they set footnotes, attaching serial numbers, service records, and photographs to a narrative that students of power could verify. Meanwhile, this paperwork culture mirrors the world of cables and briefings that shaped his instincts. Paper made the legend provable. Record beat rumor. The second line on his wrist, a Calatrava, told a different truth that is no less serious because it is simple. However, simplicity in this register is not austerity, it is discipline, the decision to wear proportion rather than attention. On the other hand, a clean three-hand dial with measured indices can communicate more control than a chorus of diamonds. Even so, the effect is not to impress strangers but to reassure equals. Proportion signaled rank without volume. What many did not see coming is how a thin case can carry more political weight than a heavy bracelet when audiences change. As a consequence of this, a watch that disappears under a cuff becomes a form of manners, a promise that the brief will be read and the meeting will end on time. Meanwhile, the code says, "I am listening," not "I am arriving," which is sometimes the higher form of power. Listening became the louder message. Visibility versus whisper, the set piece. Now the two wrists meet in a mirror where visibility and whisper negotiate the same job. However, the visible watch wins the room when a nation needs a clear outline fast, while the whispering watch wins the room when nuance matters more than applause. Meanwhile, both rely on the same foundation of reliability and service, the one in polished fluting, the other in the mathematics of the calendar. Two modes, one mission. Both speak competence. A date-only classic broadcasts rank through silhouette and ubiquity, the way a uniform broadcasts unit before a word is spoken. On the other hand, a complication broadcasts rank through literacy, the way a footnote reshapes a paragraph for the reader who notices. Even so, both watches carry the same promise that time will be respected and that promises will be kept. The promise is the product. Timekeeping is policy. But the most surprising thing is that neither path cancels the other, because power needs both clarity and nuance at different hours. As a consequence of this, the presidency becomes a gallery of wrists that solve the same problem with opposite strategies. Meanwhile, the audience changes with history, so the solution must rotate with the light. The dial adapts to the decade. The strategy rides the wrist. What many did not see coming is how our next chapter will trade pedigree for proximity and adopt materials that speak gym, base camp, and campaign bus more than ballroom. However, the lesson learned here will travel with us, because visibility and whisper will still matter when resin and loom enter the frame. On the other hand, the price will drop while the symbolism spikes, a paradox only politics can produce. When cheap becomes priceless, watch closely. Part 3. Plain folk optics and the accessible icon. One president's plastic watch became the most powerful accessory of the 1990s. Another's modest dial still glowed through wartime briefings with unshowy duty. Which message traveled farther? Bill Clinton, the two-act wrist. Clinton walked onto the inauguration stage wearing a digital Timex that looked like a gym partner rather than a gala guest, and the contrast hit like a headline. However, the choice said fitness, function, and focus at a time when the country wanted recovery without pomp. Meanwhile, the plastic case carried a message that felt almost anti-accessory. Plain folk optics won the moment. What many did not see coming was how a budget watch could create premium resonance by signaling that government would sweat, not pose. On the other hand, the 90s appetite for transparency made a resin strap feel honest rather than cheap. Even so, the stopwatch and backlight read like tools, not toys, which framed discipline as cool. Tools beat trinkets this time. As a consequence of this, the image multiplied across late-night monologues, magazine photos, and water cooler talk until the watch became a shorthand for approachability. Meanwhile, staffers and reporters mirrored the look, proving that imitation is the highest metric of political messaging. On the other hand, the device that counted laps started counting goodwill. Emulation measured impact quickly. Without subscribing, the next time you see a world leader's wrist, you'll have no idea what power, symbolism, or status it really signals. Subscribe today or keep watching in the dark. However, the second act began after office, when the same wrist discovered heavy hitters with crown guards, sandwich dials, and serious calibers. Meanwhile, Panerai cases arrived like stage lights, joined by classic maisons that spoke fluent connoisseur. On the other hand, this did not betray Act 1, because curiosity is not the enemy of humility. Curiosity deepened the character. Even so, the two-act arc became a masterclass in narrative balance because power performed access in Act 1 and passion performed expertise in Act 2. As a consequence of this, the public saw a leader who could choose restraint when needed and indulgence when allowed. Meanwhile, the lesson is simple and sharp for the camera. Context chooses the case. George W. Bush. Duty over display. Meanwhile, a different presidency favored a luminous dial that valued punctuality over prestige when the country entered crisis mode. However, a Timex with a small flag at 12 felt like a lapel pin that actually did a job. On the other hand, the price stayed low, so the message stayed high. Duty eclipsed display cleanly. What many did not see coming is how a library gift shop would later sell a kindred model so citizens could wear the narrative at cost. However, that retail echo did more than monetize nostalgia because it democratized the symbol. Meanwhile, the same glow that guided a briefing guided a school pickup. Symbols traveled by strap. Even so, the watch's vocabulary stayed strictly utilitarian with indiglo light, clear numerals, and a case you forget you are wearing. As a consequence of this, the accessory disappeared into the uniform of work rather than standing apart from it. Meanwhile, the minutes became milestones rather than ornaments. Work remained the headline. On the other hand, the semiotics of loom, resin, and stamped steel sound humble, yet they broadcast a single promise louder than precious metal. However, that promise lands well on restless days because it says, "I will arrive, I will focus, I will finish." Meanwhile, the glow is small, but the implication is large. Reliability became rhetoric. Barack Obama, the obtainable phenomenon. Meanwhile, the next chapter arrived wearing an accessible chronograph that felt like a handshake across a rope line. However, the watch carried the story of a personal gift from protective agents, which made the object read as service before style. On the other hand, the dial symmetry photographed beautifully across debates and town halls. Access met elegance cleanly. What many did not see coming is how an obtainable model could generate cult energy simply by appearing on the right wrist at the right moments. However, fans tracked references, swapped strap options, and shared granny screenshots like sports cards. Meanwhile, the watch felt joinable rather than distant because the price did not insult the paycheck. Joinable scaled enthusiasm fast. As a consequence of this, official shops and commemoratives amplified the signal until the chronograph became a souvenir of civic momentum. Meanwhile, the subdials ticked through a season of speeches and executive milestones that millions could timestamp on their own wrists. On the other hand, the effect was not hype, but participation. Participation wrote the headline. Even so, the post office pivot to a slim dress piece reset the tone from campaign energy to private poise. However, the refinement did not erase the earlier accessibility, because both chapters served different rooms. Meanwhile, understated gold indexes replaced pushers, and the silence spoke volumes. Refinement closed the loop gracefully. On the other hand, placing these three wrists side by side reveals how affordability can heighten symbolism when cameras multiply. However, a plastic case can be more persuasive than a precious alloy if the story demands sweat rather than sparkle. Meanwhile, an obtainable chronograph can outcommunicate a tourbillon during a ground game. Price is not power here. What many did not see coming is that the next era would swing the pendulum toward visible metals again, while another wrist would manage balance with calibrated restraint. However, the rules we learned still apply because optics, availability, and purpose do not retire. Meanwhile, the question sharpens for our final act. Will shine or balance win? Part 4. Opulence versus balance plus the real presidential debate. One president's wrist turned gold into a headline you could read from the back row. Another balanced steel and blue like a quiet promise that still carried. Which message will history keep? Donald Trump. Performative opulence. Trump's on-camera world favored surfaces that speak loudly, and his watches followed suit, with metal that pros light across a room before words arrive. However, a day date in yellow gold does more than keep time, because it declares the office of self with the legibility of a billboard. Meanwhile, the shape and heft read from 20 rows back without a caption. Visibility became a thesis. What many did not see coming is how gold can compress biography into a single glance by blending real estate bravado, television cadence, and campaign spectacle into one outline. On the other hand, an ellipse brings a different note, trading fluting for pure geometry that still signals pedigree on contact. Even so, the square-lined Vacheron adds a vintage echo that flatters the narrative of taste. The outline carried biography fast. As a consequence of this, the wrist became a prop that multiplied the set design, reinforcing lobbies, planes, and podiums with the same chromatic vocabulary. Meanwhile, metal functioned as message because mass and polish imply momentum before policy appears. On the other hand, the choice dared criticism by equating luxury with competence and success with suitability. Luxury argued for legitimacy. However, visibility risks fatigue when every frame shouts at equal volume and the viewer starts scanning for contrast. Meanwhile, the more the watch reads from a distance, the more it gambles on repetition as strategy. On the other hand, repetition can harden into brand if the audience accepts the bargain. Repetition minted a brand. Joe Biden calibrated balance. Biden's inauguration wrist chose a date just in steel with a blue dial and a jubilee that glints without blinding, a measured chord between heritage and modesty. However, that single choice threaded the needle between continuity and caution in a season that favored steadiness. Meanwhile, the image said institution first and individual second without sounding austere. Balance looked like policy. Even so, the rest of his rotation told a broader story as a Seamaster handled daily duty and a Speedmaster whispered national memory through the space program. On the other hand, a Seiko chronograph on the trail spoke factory shift and train platform, a vocabulary that lands well in diners and depots. Meanwhile, the occasional alarm watch nodded to older presidential customs. Heritage stayed in play. As a consequence of this, the portfolio read like a working toolkit rather than a showroom, which is why steel and loom communicated intention without anxiety. However, nothing about the selection felt accidental because every dial answered a room, a trip, or a task. Meanwhile, the result was neither hair shirt austerity nor gala shine, just calibrated presence. Calibration carried the day. What many did not see coming is how a moderate watch can outlast a louder one in memory when the moment demands repair more than spectacle. On the other hand, blue on steel photographs as trust, a tone that marketing departments measure for a reason. Even so, restraint extracts its power from fit, not from volume. Fit beat volume quietly. The big set piece, status, legacy, function. Now the debate turns formal. However, the nickname president clings to a gold day-date icon that shouts status with language everyone understands at a glance. Meanwhile, legacy belongs to the earlier alliance between an American office and a Swiss crown that taught cameras to read fluting as authority. On the other hand, function keeps its own lineage alive in alarm watches that woke war rooms as well as train stations. 3 lineages, 1 stage. Status declares, "I have arrived," and it does so with metal that registers in low light and high noise. However, legacy declares, "We have arrived," because it ties one wrist to a ribbon of predecessors with the calm of a date under a dome. Meanwhile, function declares, "I will be on time," which in government is sometimes the only promise that matters. 3 promises, 3 proofs. Even so, the decision is not either-or, because presidents borrow freely from all three shelves depending on hour and audience. As a consequence of this, a steel classic can anchor a transition, a gold flagship can anchor a rally, and an alarm can anchor a dawn call. Meanwhile, the winner is the code that fits the room. Fit remains the law. On the other hand, cameras will continue to reward silhouettes that read instantly, and specialists will continue to reward dials that reveal literacy up close. However, voters still read honesty in tools they could afford and use. Meanwhile, that triangle of status, legacy, and function will keep turning with the decade. The triangle keeps turning. Closing the circle, what the wrist really says. The pattern across eras is clear. However, the loudest watch is not always the most persuasive, and the quietest watch is not always the most virtuous. Meanwhile, the right watch for the right hour becomes policy in miniature because it teaches us what the wearer values. Values ride the wrist. Even so, the presidential wrist is a mirror where a country studies itself, asking whether power should glow, reassure, or work. On the other hand, the mirror changes with technology and taste, yet the code survives because time still structures authority. Meanwhile, a watch remains a message that moves. The message keeps moving. What many did not see coming is that our own wrists are drafting their answers every morning when we fasten steel or gold or resin before we leave. However, once you notice the code, you cannot unsee it, because every dial is a sentence and every strap is a verb. Meanwhile, the thesis stands where we began. A watch is never just a watch.